You're listening to Quantum Revolution with Karen Curry Parker, exploring new frontiers in consciousness, science, and evolution. Join us in intimate conversations with cutting-edge scientists, spiritual leaders, artists, disruptors, and visionaries who are working towards reframing the narrative of our future by healing the rift between spirituality and science, reclaiming creativity, and laying the foundation for a new world. And now, here's your host, Karen Curry Parker.
Sir Francis Bacon stated that knowledge is power. We've spent a lot of time exploring the idea of knowledge, which in this day and age is a highly mutable concept. What is knowledge? Who decides what is knowledge? Or, on a more frightening note, what is truth? Maybe it's time, instead of trying to understand what defines knowledge, we look at this statement through the exploration of what is power. In the material world and through the lens of material consciousness, power is force. Power is controlled by numbers and how much access you have to material resources. Basically, those with the most toys win. The knowledge that defines this kind of power is the ability to know how to take, seize, hustle, hoard, usurp, and steal resources. This knowledge teaches us how to play a zero-sum game and come out as the winner. Because this is a zero-sum game, no one wins until a certain group of people have power over the vast majority of resources, including information. We are living on the very edge of this formula, and if we continue this game, a whole lot of us are going to lose. We see this game being played out on many fronts on the planet at this very moment. During this season of Quantum Revolution, we heard stories from leading-edge scientists who are caught up in the reality of having to work around the system to share their research with the world. In the next few shows, you're going to hear information and conversations that might challenge you on many levels. Truth is not absolute. Quantum physics has shown us that our material world is highly malleable and responsive to the energy with which we create. Truth is also evolving. If we shut the doors to exploring other truths, even if they're packaged in ways that challenge us to have to listen with curiosity and without judgment, then we run the risk of missing key pieces of the puzzle. If we embrace the idea that truth is not absolute and that many people hold key pieces to the evolving puzzle of truth, then we must cultivate an attitude that allows others to speak their truths, even if it doesn't agree with yours. Today's guest, Rich Jacobs, challenged me to really hear someone else's truth, even though some of it is in direct conflict with mine. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Quantum Revolution. I'm Karen Curry Parker, and we are talking today with Rich Jacobs, who is the creator of the Finding Genius podcast and also the Finding Genius nonprofit organization, where he works to help people who are struggling with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. I want to bring you here today because one of the things that I have loved going through this amazing podcast that you've curated so beautifully is that you bring into the world, as someone who I think is a very holistic thinker, this wide range of scientists who are really courageous enough to buck the status quo and say, hey, if we actually embark on genuine scientific inquiry, what we assume as truth, what we've been building systems upon for hundreds of years, might not actually be valid anymore, or maybe it wasn't valid in the first place. I want to start first, though, before we dive into this, I want to start a little bit with your backstory.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I work with lawyers doing marketing for them. We deal with a couple hundred firms around the U.S. and ones that do bankruptcy or family law or criminal defense, personal injury, that kind of stuff. And by associating with them for so long, I've become like them.
You've also been part of curating a book about viruses and understanding or reinterpreting the science behind viruses. You are what I would consider to be, I'll call you a generalist, somebody with a generalist perspective on science. How did you get to this query about health and wellness and exploring the leading edge of what is truth in science, especially in the science of well-being?
I always ask questions. I'm always learning constantly. And my wife is like, leave me alone, go learn something. You're not busy enough. So I was really interested in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. a friend of mine was doing a podcast and he's like, why don't you do one? You're always asking questions. And I started with cryptocurrency companies and I interviewed probably about 100 of them. I really enjoyed the process. I ended up putting on a conference for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and cryptocurrencies. And I interviewed probably 350 different companies in the space doing that. I took all the material I learned, I put it into a book, and I put on a conference. And it's just thrilling to interview people and to learn stuff every day. I would be on a high. I remember a couple of days, I did one interview on quantum computing, one on 3D printing, one on cryptocurrency, and one on like space exploration, all in the same day.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt amazing. It was so cool to learn all this stuff. So I kept going and going with it. One night I was coming home from a coffee shop real late and I got run off the highway, literally. And I got a concussion from the hit because this guy hit me at probably like 100 miles an hour. And the impact knocked me back so hard that my seat broke and the whole back of the car got crunched in, the back seat and the trunk, and a piece of molding got pushed in and it speared the back of my head. When I came to a stop in the accident, my glasses came off, the window shattered. There was like blood all over the place. Ended up going to the hospital. They did a CT scan of the head and neck and they said, oh, you have nodules in your thyroid. I said, okay, I don't know what that means. A month or two down the line, after going to the doctor, they told me I had thyroid cancer. When you hear something like that, your insides liquefy. And all of a sudden I realized I may not make it to 80, 85 and just pass away in my sleep. It may happen in a month or two. So it's changed everything. And I changed the focus of the podcast to be more about health and wellness. I started interviewing people about cancer, obviously, about all kinds of health issues. And it went from there. So that's how it started and that's how it changed.
One of the things that I noticed on your podcast is that you bring and you interview people who really are oftentimes presenting a non-mainstream perspective on scientific findings. And in particular, you've done a lot of podcast interviews. And of course, you've published a book on viruses. I'm curious, again, from your big picture perspective of looking at our assumptions about viruses, our assumptions about virology. What is the most important thing that you think pops out in light of COVID and all these other things that we've been grappling with for the last couple of years?
I'll tell you a little bit about the process of how I did the book, because I think that'll inform some of the answer. I was interested in viruses. It was just part of the curriculum that I've been making and interviewing people on. So I interviewed probably 100 some odd scientists on viruses, and I started asking more and more questions. And when I go into a field, at first I know nothing. The first 5-10 interviews are like vocabulary. Once I get to 20, 30, I'm starting to ask better questions. Once I get to 100, I'm asking really good questions. And people are like, are you in the industry? Do you want to work for us? That kind of thing. Because I'm truly interested in, once I get to interviewing, let's say 100 plus people, I can see the landscape below me. Who's doing what? Who's studying this? Who's studying that? So I have an industry. I have a real top-down view. And a lot of these people don't talk to each other very much. They'll read papers, but they're not going to sit there and like interview 100 colleagues. If they did, I think it would really help them push a lot faster in science because they would see, oh, Bob is studying this and Sue is studying that. And I know they do some of that, but they're not nearly as communicative and social as they should be. So I did all these interviews and I said, I want to put together a book on this, but what I want to do is I'm going to take all the questions I've been asking that everyone goes, that's a good question. I don't know. So I took all those questions and I re-interviewed, I think, the most articulate ones. And I made a book out of that. So that was fun because it was like the next level of interviewing. It was like the Olympics of interviewing. So I was asking really, really hard questions of the best people I could find. So that's what made the book. To answer your question, the number one thing I found that gave me good answers or bad answers is whether people believe viruses are alive or not, and whether they have some level of cognition. And a lot of people go, virus is not going to have any level of cognition. They say the same thing about human cells. Look at you, look at me. We're made of cells. They're all robots, but yet we're not. It doesn't make any sense. All our cells are robots, but the cells that make up our brain, they're special. And they're this thing called consciousness, and they make this thing called consciousness. Well, why? What's different between my brain cells and the rest of my liver cells? Why are these cognitive and these not? Why are all the things that compose me dumb and machine-like, but I have a brain? It makes no sense. And I saw from the answers I got, the scientists that said, oh, it's just random mutation and viruses aren't alive, and blah, blah, blah. Their answers were short, almost like laughing, like the answer is obvious. Viruses are not alive. No way. But the people that said, yes, they are, or they think they are, their minds were a lot more open and they give me much better answers. What I've learned through doing these interviews and all that is You have to keep an open mind and you have to deliberately be anthropomorphic. When you think of things, deliberately think, does this make sense in terms of what people do? Does this make sense in terms of other living things do? If you assume, again, like a virus is just a dead thing that just reacts to random stimuli, you'll think about it like this. If you think it could be alive and it could, in its own way, think and coordinate action, now you have a much bigger perspective. And that was the number one thing I came across. I've recently finished a book on cancer. Is the exact same thing. Is cancer a separate life form, or is it just cells that have mutated? Same answers, same pattern I see. And I see that pretty much in every field.
Here's what I heard you say is that when scientists are building research projects and they are deeply married to propagating what is already known, we'll call that closed-minded, or maybe we'll call that an internal forgetting of curiosity, that prohibits them from seeing the bigger picture.
They're not bad people, but they got to pay bills. They got to get their research funded, first of all. And the people that have the purse strings, NIH and stuff like that, say, you can investigate that. You can't investigate that. You can't assume that. So they direct the research and the people know it's a game. How am I going to get my dad to give me $10 to go to the movies? I got to tell him this. I got to do this. I got to clean my room. Same thing with scientists. How am I going to get the NIH to fund my research? Well, I got to do this. I got to present it this way. I got to say this. So they're very constrained. Their whole education has told them, don't think anthropomorphically. Neo-Darwinism is what rules the world. Everything is random mutation, and you can't ascribe human qualities or living qualities to many biological things, which I think is absurd. They're good people and they try, but a lot of them just are under this weight and this burden of what they have to do. They can't do science how they want to do it.
Well, I think that kind of matches a lot of the conversations we had in our last season of Quantum Revolution, because we had a lot of scientists who, even after the mic was off, were reporting how they couldn't really do what they wanted to do or investigate what they wanted to investigate until they had created structures to financially support their research outside of the confines of the traditional research support system.
Yep.
So I'm curious, as you're talking, I have two questions. And the first question is really more just a geek/nerd question. What was the most fascinating thing you learned about viruses that was like, oh, that's really cool?
Viruses don't act alone. If you're infected with flu, if you looked at the DNA or RNA of the flu virus, you're getting thousands of different versions. So what you're being infected with is a swarm of very similar but different viruses that are all called flu. Same thing with bacteria in your body. You have E. coli in your body, but there's countless strains. So you don't just have one kind of E. coli in your body. You have a lot of different variants. Same thing with viruses. And viruses do tend to act like honeybees or ants as a swarm. That's what I've seen from interviewing people, which is amazing. I don't know how they do it. The virus supposedly is like this protein coat with genetic material inside. There's supposedly no brain or nothing, but they're able to act on information and change what they do based on how the information interacts with them. When they attempt to dock with a cell, depending on the condition of the cell, they'll act differently, and they do seem to be able to coordinate. And when they enter into a cell, it's like the virus got in front of the control panel and now it's able to do stuff and have the cell do its bidding. How could it do that if it's not alive? It's so stripped down in terms of its structure. How does it do all these things? So I've gotten to the point now where I'm just amazed by viruses, and you can't assume that they're known quantities. They're so mysterious and they're so difficult to profile. Supposedly over millions of years, viruses have literally become part of our own DNA. It's called endogenization.
Mm-hmm.
People's DNA, about 8 to 9% of it is viruses. Like when women, in order for them to be able to be pregnant and form the placenta and isolate the baby, there's a protein called syncytin. This appears that it comes from a virus. So there would be no placental animals. There would be no people without a virus having given some of its genetic material to people. So I thought that's pretty amazing. There were 8-9% virus at least.
Okay, so if we extrapolate that back, placental animals, mammals, we would not have evolved had it not been for viruses. So viruses can be evolutionary agents. Yes?
Yeah, viruses may be the prime driver of evolutionary agents, which is crazy.
And also makes Darwinism questionable.
Well, look, where's a new species that people have seen created? No one's seen one. Where did life come from? No one knows. When does life come from non-life? No one's ever seen it. So there's all these things that are assumptions that we've never seen. Oh, this happened over millions of years. How do you know? You can infer maybe from evidence, but you don't know. So we've never seen a new species come about. We've never seen a lot of things. It's just odd that we've never seen it. Why, I don't know. And these are probably impossible things to answer, but there's a lot unknown. It's really interesting.
I've been contemplating, and the next question I really want to ask you is, why don't people trust science? A little bit of a preamble to that. We teach Darwinism as if it's truth. We forget sometimes that it's the theory of evolution. It's not the fact of evolution, right? And so we don't question it. Many of us don't question it. You get out of high school, you're like, I'm never going to do that again. Moving on, next topic. And so this creates this very interesting, I think, cultural or collective problem of how do we know what's true, which I think has been a big issue in our collective in the last few years. Science is seemingly this very scripted, rational process. It's a system, right? We go back to middle school science fair projects. You come up with a hypothesis, you structure your experiment, you explore, you do statistical analysis and determine that X amount of times this is a duplicable process that allows us to predict the future, right? It propagates the known. If it's such a rational, reasonable process, why do people distrust it so much at this stage in our collective consciousness?
Because it's become very politicized. It's become a weapon, frankly. The process of peer review. You think there's anonymous people that just on the merits of your paper approve it or don't? No. I've heard from many, many scientists. They'll say, we're on peer review boards. And sometimes we got to approve articles we don't want to. Because when we put out a paper, if that same person, Bob, is on that peer review, they'll kill it. They'll never let it through. And I've heard it from dozens and dozens and dozens of scientists. We'll talk about climate, become very politicized. I'm in the middle of a series. I've interviewed probably 40 climate change people, for and against. I'm not just going to interview the for. I looked in the literature, PubMed. Go look for a paper that challenges or questions the climate science models or questions that global warming is really happening or that carbon is a problem. They don't exist because they're not allowed to exist. So when science has become this politicized, one-sided thing, you're in a lot of trouble. This happened with cigarettes decades ago, and the cigarette companies did everything they could to put out warped studies. This happened, frankly, over the past 2 years. I'm not going to name names or whatever, but look how politicized it's become. If it's science, why can't you debate and why can't you talk about things? That's very suspicious. Why is anecdotal evidence demonized? So, for instance, Lipitor, some drug, right? They approved it probably with a cohort, with a group of 30 to 50 people they tested it on. They only tested it on men. They don't test it on women. They don't test it on women during the different parts of their cycle. They don't test it on Asians versus blacks versus whites. They don't test it depending on age. But yet, millions and millions and millions of people take it. So now if the drug company wanted, they could get millions of people's medical records and see really how Lipitor affects them. They're not going to do that unless there's some recall or a huge problem. So all that evidence, they say, oh, it's anecdotal, it's garbage. You have 10,000 times more evidence or 1 million times more evidence. That's better than 30 to 50 people in your test control group? I don't think so. Science has just become politicized and corrupted, just 100% frankly. And you're not going to see a lot of stuff out there that you should see. It's just not allowed.
And I would say, again, your perspective is one that we've heard over and over again, just from different scientists, from astrophysicists to people who study water and the structure of water. We've talked to all kinds of scientists and they say the same thing. If we want to do real science, we're going to have to change the way the system is funded and the way in which we interpret data.
And yeah, it's a whole freaking mess.
You have a nonprofit, findinggeniusfoundation.org. And part of what you're doing is helping people with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Talk to me a little bit about, first of all, why this giant topic?
Because over the past 2 years, I've seen in myself and in my family and in my kids and in other people's kids and other people, everyone's getting more and more anxious. A lot of people are getting depressed. People are on medication. People are stressed. And it's messing up everyone's heads. So I just see it becoming a huge problem. And in my own family, when there's an incident where someone's really depressed or stressed or whatever, it causes huge conflict. And there's been times, just frankly, that I'll sit there and I'm like, what's the point of anything I've done if I can't hold my family together? If they can't get along, let's say, what's the point? There is no point. To me, anxiety, depression, and all that, I see it everywhere in people now. Like this past Thanksgiving, we went to go see some friends. One friend, I've known him for 40 years. And hence, I know his family probably about 30 years. So I know these people. And I can tell you every single one of them was diminished, sad, couldn't talk well. And I overheard them speaking about all their children. There was 4 or 5 different parents there. Every parent had kids that were anxious and having problems with socializing and all that. And that's not good. I'm in my mid 40s and I grew up at a great time. I was around people all the time. I had tons of friends. I went outside. I did all kinds of stuff. And now society is a mess. And I just see that it's a big problem. If people don't work on their mental health, I think society is really, really headed for a huge problem. So that's why.
I'm going to assume, and I might be wrong, but I'm going to assume you take this broad perspective. You've kind of unraveled some of the ways we think about viruses. It sounds like you've just done the same thing in looking at cancer. I'm going to guess you're doing the same thing around anxiety, depression, and PTSD, yes?
Yeah, I'm working on an interview series, but I'm also trying to develop ways to help people themselves. I'm trying to come forth with an initiative to help people that have these problems myself. So in order to do that, I need to interview hundreds and hundreds of people. I'm probably up to about 80, 90, and I'm getting more and more perspective. But again, I'm open to anything. So I'm collecting from this group and this group and this group and trying to put it all together into a cohesive whole to actually make an impact on the problem. There's like dozens of different things that you can do to help yourself, but I want to try to include them all. There's people doing psilocybin or ecstasy, ketamine, things like that, and they're having great results. Like I've interviewed people at Johns Hopkins that are doing the clinical trials on psilocybin, and they're seeing amazing results. Some people taking 2 doses of psilocybin, no depression for 6 months. And these people, every week they had a problem otherwise. So there's a lot of solutions out there, and I want to gather them all and present them and let people decide, I'm going to look into this, I'm going to look into that. I don't know about that. I'm going to look into that. That's my goal with it.
That's the treatment side. I'm curious about, and I think there are so many interesting branches coming out. And certainly, even in some of the work that we do at the quantum alignment system, we use a lot of energy psychology techniques and subtle body techniques that work on reframing narrative. When you look at the numbers around anxiety, PTSD, depression, and you look at the correlation between, say, burnout and anxiety, PTSD and depression, I mean, the numbers hover anywhere from 65 I've seen to 85% of people. What do you think is going on? Why are we all so stressed, depressed, anxious? What is the source of this?
Well, there's a couple major factors. Like Johan Hari, who I just interviewed, wrote a book called Stolen Focus, and all this social media, all this texting, all this constant phone, TikTok, all that. If you're on it hours a day, which people are, and during lockdowns, they're on constantly, all day Zoom, all day this, all day that. Your whole life is a screen. There's no real interaction with people, and you're constantly being pinged. So let me look at it. Someone texted me, oh, there's a social media update. It's just constant stealing of your attention. If you're fragmented, you can't really enjoy experiences. I felt much more fragmented over the past few years. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. It's hard for me to concentrate. Like I'll take my son to a movie and he gets bored after 20, 30 minutes. And I'm like, we're going to stay and finish the movie. And he don't like that because his attention span has been corrupted. Couples I see eating out, they'll talk and then they'll be like this on the phone. It's weird. So that's one huge problem. Another problem is that strife has been amplified. I believe people are being pitted against each other. The media is one of the worst poisons out there. It's constantly stoking problems, constantly. And that's what I see. We're told, oh, worry about this. And now we worry about this. And now we worry about that. And it's keeping us busy with bread and circuses. I would say food, relationships, and attention maybe are the top 3 that are causing this problem.
So what have you learned about food?
Well, here's the funny thing I say. So there's been no clinical trial. There's no double-blind placebo clinical trial to see if food will keep you alive. There's no double-blind placebo clinical trial to see if air will keep you alive. But yeah, we do it. We drink it. We eat it. We breathe it. And a lot of scientists will say, oh, diet doesn't matter. If you live to be 90, what's the only thing keeping you alive? Food, water, air. But no, those things aren't important in your biology. Okay. There's even a dismissal of nutrition in all of health and all of science. When you have this inverted world of things that just make no sense and you're forced to live in that world, I think it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of problems in people. And I think that's what's happening is people are being told so much BS and manipulated in such a way that I think they know there's something wrong in their head. It's like the Matrix in a way. They know there's something wrong. They can't figure out what it is. But I just see this in everyone I talk to. Everyone's tired. Everyone's anxious. Everyone's unhappy. It wasn't like this years ago. Something's very wrong. And I believe that there's many causes.
For many years, I've been talking about ADD and what is ADD. I come from a background personally where I grew up without television and I lived overseas. I moved back to the United States when I was.
You survived somehow.
I survived. And I still can't watch TV. I literally can't. It's like there is something in my internal cadence because I think I didn't grow up with it. I am not conditioned to watch videos and programs and shows. I joke with my kids. I'm like, I tried twice to really sit down and like binge watch something. And I really think if I die and there's a hell, I'm going to be forced to binge watch stuff. And I feel like it does steal my focus. I don't like the way I feel if I just sit and watch a program, and certainly back to back to back to back episodes and then have that be the topic of conversation. We can't go to any dinner parties anymore, anywhere, or any conversations anywhere without it eventually leading back to television shows. It's an interesting thing to see because I feel like I'm from another planet. I'm from the planet that doesn't have TV. And so my whole perspective on the world is different. And I see the correlation between a quest for meaning and time spent on devices. There's a sort of an inverse relationship. And the more time you spend on a device, the more you feel like life is meaningless, but you're not cultivating your own meaning. So whose fault is that? I don't want to say blame because it's really not fault. I think it's part of our entrainment and part of our conditioning. And I have a fantasy that if we all get off our devices for whatever reason for 2 weeks, who would we become? I think it would be a very interesting contemplation. I'm not saying, and I really want to be really clear, there are a lot of people on this planet who are currently experiencing massive amounts of trauma. And I think trauma itself is carried and impacts the body and the brain and the functioning of the brain. And we see there are a lot of people coming out and saying the body holds that. It affects the way the brain works. It affects physiology. And so I am not in any way downplaying that that doesn't also have a role in anxiety, depression, and PTSD. If we don't resolve it and we don't start asking what is it in our society that is so traumatizing to people that we are disconnecting as a protective measure psychologically, these are bigger questions. But I do think, man, if we could just get off the devices.
My kids started bugging me for them when they were like 6, 7, and we held out till they were like 12, 13, but can't hold out any longer than that.
Yeah, we have a wait until 8th grade policy in our house. And I do see the difference even in my daughter, who's 12. She still doesn't have a phone yet, my youngest. And I see a difference in the way in which she interacts with other kids in her community. She has a certain amount of innocence still that I think socially is starting to become challenging for her. It's forcing me to have to explore this conversation from a different perspective because she's on the edge of growing. But at the same time, she has the freedom to choose when she's going to emerge into a state that goes beyond her innocence. And she'll tell me, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready to talk about what's my sexual orientation or some of the things that these other kids are talking about. And I'm not saying that they're not ready, but I'm wondering how much of it is that media has pushed them before they're able to discern. And what do you do with 12 and 13-year-olds that don't have quite the ability to discern yet? That does cause anxiety.
It's not just the use of the technology, it's what they're being told. Like I remember we were doing something on Einstein, and my son's like, when he was younger, like 12, he goes, Dad, Einstein was a racist. I said, no. He grew up at a time completely different from now. It was 100-something years ago. Well, not 100, but 70, 80 years ago. You can't compare him to people today. His contributions and all that stand no matter what. To just say, oh, he's a racist, get rid of him. That's a lot of culture nowadays. And I think it's really short-sighted and terrible. But this is some of the poison that they're being told online. And I have to constantly combat it. They come to me and they'll tell me this, that, and the other. And I'll be like, I'll give them more of a perspective on it at least. Some of it I agree, some of it I don't. But they're seeing and hearing stuff. So social media is teaching your children, whoever's listening. It's not just that they're using it. They're on the phone constantly. They're being told and instructed in whatever is on social media. And if you don't like that, it's a problem. So you got to find out what your kids and what people you know are being told, because it's changing their mindset and it's affecting them. How could it not?
It's interesting because I think it also goes back to your conversation about connections. I read a research study a few years ago that said the single biggest indicator as to whether a child is successful in school is whether they have a family dinner every night. And that the more children, and that this is not just for children, it's for all of us, because it's good for us. It's good for humans, I think. The more we come together and talk to each other, the better children are able to function. I think there's an exploration there for all of us in terms of looking at well-being. How can we increase our connections, refocus our focus, and my grandmother would say, eat good food, and see how that might shift our perspective. One last comment from you. In all the explorings that you've done, the explorings that you've done around viruses and science and cancer and anxiety and all these pieces, what do you think right now in this moment? And it is March 2022, where things are still pretty disrupted on this planet at this point. What do you think is the single biggest, most important thing that somebody needs to contemplate right now to tap into in this disruptive cycle that we're in, a higher sense of well-being and meaning?
I would say like people really need to connect with other people. Call somebody. If you have a friend, call them. Don't just text them. Don't just Instagram them or whatever it is, or Snapchat them. Call the person. Go visit them. Have people over for dinner. Go hang out with people. Go ask questions. Go interact. Don't be isolated, because I don't see how almost anybody, even the most introverted person, still needs to go out and talk to people and have relationships. If you have no relationships, if you have no friends, if you have no interaction, you will not be happy. I guarantee you. So you must live. Who wants to have on their tombstone, oh, I scrolled over 80,000 hours on TikTok? Do you want your whole life to be like these fragments of little things that you kind of looked at and heard? And it also makes you very reactionary. If you're just taking information in, you're not sitting there and thinking about it and not discussing stuff with people, you're just receiving. You're not thinking. And there's people that I don't think they've ever thought deeply in their lives about anything. So this needs to be improved and fixed. People really need to just get out and live real life. Go sit in the sun for 5 minutes a day. It's not going to kill you. It'll help you. Go talk to somebody. When I take my kids to a restaurant, I'll tell them, go ahead, order, look up. Hello, how are you? Order your food. Come on. They go, Dad. But I get them to do it. I don't want them to be, why do I have to order the food and they can sit there in the devices? They need to be able to talk to people and integrate and stuff. So that's probably the number one, I would think. Maybe number two, if there is a number two, is if there are issues that you're concerned about, research them. Don't just like listen to the news and say, oh, okay, I know what the deal is. Talk to people on both sides of the issue if you're really interested in it. Think about it, look at it, study it, and see, okay, can I make an impact on this issue and help people? Or at least do I understand more deeply what's going on with this issue? And now I can think about it in a better way instead of just being reactionary. If you just react to inbound stuff, you have no power. You're going to be manipulated 100%.
Finding Genius is your podcast. Again, if you all have not listened to Finding Genius, go there. There are so many intriguing and interesting points of view, so many interesting scientists who I think really their conclusions blow the lid off of what we assume to be true. And then, of course, findinggeniusfoundation.org is your nonprofit. When is your new book coming out?
Oh, we just put out one on cancer that came out about a month ago.
Finding Genius, Understanding Cancer, 30 questions, 70 geniuses, 200 plus amazing insights. What's the next one?
We've got one being worked on, it's almost done, about sleep. And then anxiety and depression will probably be after that. Working on one on climate change. There's a lot. The podcast is good, but I also want to put it in a different form, a curated form for people to help them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us for Quantum Revolution.
Thank you.
Logic perpetuates what is already known. We need logic and science to help us predict what works and what doesn't. But is logic the only kind of truth? The proof of patterns, which is essentially what logic is, helps us predict the future. But as we evolve, patterns have to get disrupted. Otherwise, nothing changes or grows. Even nature disrupts her patterns to create new normals. The scientific method works, but science as a system is broken. Over and over again in our interviews and conversations with scientists who are brave enough to speak out about the dysfunction of academia and the ways in which we fund research, we've learned that unless new scientific data fits within a certain box of parameters, it doesn't necessarily get shared with the world. We discount anecdotal evidence, forgetting that anecdotal evidence gives us an essential spark of curiosity that can initiate new hypotheses and be foundational for exploring new ideas. new truths. Anecdotal evidence is not true. It just hasn't been repeated enough times to make it statistically valid. When it comes to health research, the scientific system relegates individual lives to mere numbers. We embrace acceptable risks and discount individual experiences. We consider anecdotal evidence as unproven or even unsafe. But what if it's your life, or the life of someone you love? Do the numbers mean the same when the lives you care about are on the line? How do we vet what is right for our individual lives? There is a separate set of questions we also have to ask ourselves, especially during this time on the planet. If truth is malleable, who is right? What are the absolute truths and values that you choose to live by? And how can we better hear each other and find the commonalities, even if elements of someone else's truth don't match with yours? I don't have the answers to these questions, but I invite you this week to explore the question of where is the sliver of commonality within the Venn diagram of humanity? Where are the intersections between me and we? And what lives in those slivers that can unify us and help us engineer our way forward as champions of an ever-evolving understanding of what is true and what is truth? What if, together, we can find the solutions to the challenges facing humanity today, even if individually we are quite different? I'm Karen Curry Parker. If you'd like to explore the truth about who you are and why you're here on the planet at this time, please visit www.quantumalignmentsystem.com. Thank you for joining me for Quantum Revolution.
Thank you for joining us on Quantum Revolution with Karen Curry Parker. We hope you found this conversation inspiring. For more information on how to change your world and to hear more about our guest today, visit quantumrevolutionpodcast.com. Make sure you follow us on your favorite podcasting platform so you don't miss a single episode of Quantum Revolution. We'll see you next time for some more groundbreaking conversations with Karen and her guest. How will you impact your world today?